Track and sign has been part of the human experience since people existed. So it helped people out a long time ago. If you got up in the morning and walked outside and you saw deer tracks or antelope tracks, that may help you feed your family. Alternatively, if you saw lion or bear tracks, that would help you protect your family. So it was used by everybody. In modern times, we don't necessarily use it like that as often as we did then, but it's used in wildlife biology field work. If there's a highly skilled tracker, the accuracy of the work, there's a lot of studies actually that are showing that that is helping wildlife biology studies come up with better data. So in fact, some of the organizations won't even hire people unless they're certified. So we'd like to see more of that. It maximizes your eco-literacy, and most of all, it allows you to know the stories when you're walking in the woods or wherever you might be. You can tell what happened when you weren't there. So my name is Shane Hawkins, and I'm certified through Tracker Certification North America at level 4, which is professional certification. I've also taken classes with Southwest Online Tracker Training, currently doing a tracker mentoring course with an organization out of South Africa that is international. And I've worked with George Leoniak, who's a very high-ranking tracker, Jim Lowry, Dan Gardoki, and I currently work with Original Wisdom, which is an international education company, and I'm one of the North American instructors. There's 4 of us. And then WildTrack, which is using AI, they're training an AI, which is an artificial intelligence, to recognize footprints. And then they're using that all over the world for non-invasive wildlife monitoring. So kind of a cool thing. So that's in my spare time. For my job, I run a music and arts nonprofit organization. So this is very different what I do when I'm not at work. But you can find me kind of squatted down out in the field most of the time. So what are we talking about? What is track and sign? Tracks, of course, like these raccoon tracks. Trails, which is a series of tracks. This is a bear trail. Scat or poop. This is a very impressive red fox scat. Dens and burrows. So this is a porcupine den. They're prolific poopers and horrible housekeepers. So their scat just kind of pours out of the den just like this. And if you know what to look for, you can find those in the woods. Chews. So a lot of animals chew wood, either for scent marking or for feeding. So this is porcupine chews on, they're eating the cambium layer of the tree. Nests and feathers. But it's also skulls, which is the last track that an animal leaves. And beds, like this red fox bed. I trailed this red fox a couple of years ago and found this neat and tidy little round bed that showed me that he had been there a long time, enough to melt the snow, and it was up on a high ridge, so he was watching what was going on, safety and security. And then feeding sign. These are hickory nuts, and a lot of squirrels will feed on hickory nuts. A lot of animals will feed on hickory nuts, but they all have a different pattern. So these are red squirrels feeding on hickory nuts. Digs. This is a skunk digging for grubs and insects in the pine litter underneath the white pine. And then holes. Holes come in all different sizes. The first one on the left with the blue ruler is a D-shaped hole in an ash tree. It's an emerald ash borer exit hole. And then on the right is a little bit larger. If you see the scale, it's an inch and a quarter diameter, and that's a chipmunk hole. Now, everybody has different ways that they dig the holes, different shapes, different placement, and you can learn a lot about what lives there just by knowing what those are. And then pellets. So a lot of people are interested, well, I guess they know that owls pellet, and you can dissect an owl pellet and find mandibles of small mammals and all kinds of fur and things like that, bones, but a lot of birds pellet. So this is a crow pellet. Herons will pellet, lots of other birds will as well. And then galls. This is a spongy oak apple gall wasp gall. It's from an oak tree, and galls can be caused by insects like wasps and midge flies, or they can be caused by viruses, fungus, bacteria, just kind of a unique thing to find out there. And then rubs and scrapes. So right now in New York State, we have the rut going on, which is with white-tailed deer. And you'll find scrapes on the ground that they do with their hooves, the bucks, or you'll find antler rubs like this one. And they'll just rub their antlers and tell everybody else that they're there and how big they are. And it's a communication scent marking kind of activity. So tracks and signs, if you are interested and you want to find them, how do you do that? Tracks, you want to find substrate that tracks will register. And if you're looking at your lawn, not typically going to be able to see much if an animal walks there. But if you can find sand, dust, or better yet, mud or snow, you can see and trail things for miles. And then signs exist everywhere that animals exist, but you have to know what to look for. So we're going to talk mostly about tracks tonight, but if you are interested in more information, we could also do more on sign. So how to track? Be curious. That's the number one thing. Slow down, use all your senses. Sometimes you're going to smell sign, sometimes you'll see it, sometimes you'll just notice a break in the baseline. So what I mean by that is if you're looking out, it snowed overnight and you see a fresh coating of snow, and then all of a sudden in the corner you see kind of a disturbance and you walk over and there's tracks. That's what you're looking for. It's kind of easy when it's snow, but you can also learn to do it in leaf litter and on lawn grass. Breaks in the baseline will show up everywhere if you know what to look for. So you gather that evidence, you can identify what animals are on the landscape, you can locate them if you trail them, you can understand and interpret animal behavior, and basically just know what's happening when you're not there. Because a lot of these animals are nocturnal and you're not going to see what they're doing necessarily in person. So how do you build your knowledge? We call it dirt time. So that just means going outside, seeing what you notice, taking photos or drawing things. Some people, despite running an arts organization, I'm not artistic, so I don't do the nature journaling things, but I take a lot of photographs, and I typically have a ruler with me that I'll throw on the ground just for scale. So when I'm looking at the pictures later, I have an idea of the size. You think you're going to remember, but it's not that easy. Joining online groups. There's a very strong online group of trackers. There's many different groups, but I'll give you a couple names of my favorite ones that are very accurate and filled with people who are very knowledgeable at the end of this talk. And then share what you don't know and ask questions so that other people can help you. Next, you'd want to learn morphology, which is just a fancy word for saying the structure of the foot. And we're going to go into that quite a bit tonight. Learn about the behavior. Are they nocturnal? Are they diurnal, meaning during the day? Are they crepuscular, which means dawn and dusk? What are their life cycles? When do they breed? Breeding behavior is very different than behavior when they're not in the breeding cycle. What do they eat? What type of habitat do they live in? And then a whole other discussion would be on gaits. We're just going to touch on that very briefly. But a gait is a preferred way to travel, and every animal has a preferred way to travel. They can do all of the gaits, walking, trotting, galloping, but in general, most species have a preferred speed, either walking or trotting usually. So morphology, how can you study morphology? You can look at books. There's a lot of good ones. I have some listed at the end of this. You can look at drawings that other people have done, plaster casts, which are great for studying because it's the actual foot. You're pouring the plaster into a track. Study feet. So this is a porcupine foot. My very indulgent husband brought me some roadkill to study, but this is a hind foot, and I know that because of the number of toes and just the foot structure. This is a rodent, but doesn't have a foot like other rodents, just really different. So it was very interesting to be able to see that outside of a book. This is a skunk foot over here in the plaster cast, and you can see some heel pads here. You see that it has 5 fingers, just like we do, and really long claws, which is one indicator for skunks. And then over here, we have a track that we're going to talk a little bit more about in just a second. So one important thing is measuring tracks. all animals have a range of normal tracks of how big or small they can be. Of course, there's going to be outliers sometimes, but you want to have an idea if you're looking for fox tracks of what size you're looking for. So you want to be able to measure accurately. Very easy when they're on a hard surface like this plywood. A little bit more difficult when they are registering in a softer substrate like this mud. So you would want to find the track floor, which is basically the edge, which is very easy to see in this track. And your edge is back here. And then your side edges are very clear to see in the left side track. But in the mud, you're going to have to go all the way down into this track to find the floor. You don't want to go where these cracks are or back here where the cracks are, because that's not truly where the foot was. That's just how the substrate is reacting to the pressure. And size matters. So if you're looking at a coyote track versus a bobcat track, you know, you want to know that the bobcat is going to be smaller than the coyote. And especially for animals that have similar morphology, like this domestic cat and bobcat, the only difference is size. You know, they're very, very similar. They both have this trapezoidal palm pad. They both have these pointed toes. There's a few differences. Domestic cats are usually more of a bean shape, but that doesn't hold true always. So you really want to look for size. About 1.5 inches or smaller are domestic cats, and about 1 3/4 inches and larger are bobcats. So, you know, of course, there's always going to be outliers, but just know your sizes if you're going to get really deep into tracking. So measuring tracks, here's that nice track. This is my dog's track, and he's standing on plywood with a wet foot. So this track was not going to last very long, but I did snap a picture. And if you're measuring length, you're going to measure those edges. If you're measuring width, you're going to measure the outside edges. Okay, so number of toes. The next thing you want to look for is, well, the next thing you want to learn is how many toes are animals usually registering. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have additional toes. If you look at a cat or a dog leg, they have 4 toes on their foot, but they have another claw up higher and another toe pad, which is called a dew claw. And if you have a cat or dog, you should look. And then there's also a carpal pad on the back. So we're looking at what normally registers. So if a cat or dog is walking, they're normally going to have 4 toes. But some of these animals do have some other toes that don't typically register. So horses and donkeys, we have a donkey hoof up here, registering more oval. And then we have a horse down in the lower right, and those are more round. There's also some differences with the frog, which is this triangular piece, and the heel buttresses, which are back here, that you can tell donkey and horse tracks apart. So those are one-toed animals. Two-toed animals are your white-tailed deer, which is up at the top here, and elk, which are down in the lower right. Also cows, goats, moose. So here in New York State, we have deer, a lot of deer, of course. And then we also have moose up in the Adirondacks. And you're probably going to see some cow and goat tracks, but they have 2 toes. Back to our feline and canine. So they're registering these 4 toes. And 4 toes here. This is a bobcat track and a coyote track. 5 toes. A lot of animals have 5 toes on their front and hind feet, just like we do. So up here in the upper right, we have an opossum track, and they have really strange feet. If you've ever had a chance to look at them or find their tracks, they're some of my favorite to find. So this is a left hind track of an opossum. They have a thumb over here, and then they've got these little thin fingers in a row of 3, and then one kind of outlier. So we can make this shape with our own hand, and we can make their front foot track with our own hand as well. This is a left front track of an opossum. And then we saw our raccoons earlier. These are perfect raccoon tracks, but raccoons have hands like we do. So they can register in a lot of different ways, and they are called the trickster of the tracking world, or the humbler of the tracking world, because they can fool you. They can look like bobcat tracks. They can look like a lot of different things. But raccoon tracks are very common in our areas, and we can usually find them. Other animals that have 5 toes on front and hind feet would be bears. Everybody in the weasel family, so that includes in New York State, least weasel, short-tailed weasel, long-tailed weasel, fishers, otters, and I think that's martens. We have some martens up in the Adirondacks. So all of the weasel family, skunks, shrews, which are very tiny, but counting toes is one way you can tell a shrew from a mouse. Mice have different number of toes, and then opossums, of course. All right, so our rodent family. This is our mouse, our squirrels, our woodchuck. They have 4 toes on the front feet. So this is a bound of a gray squirrel down here. They have 1, 2, 3, 4 toes on the front feet, which are these 2. And then their hind feet have 5 toes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The difference in a rodent foot is that they have a definite pattern. The front foot is in a 1-2-1 pattern. So we have 1 and then 2 together and 1. And the hind foot is in a different pattern. We have 1 and then 3 in a row and 1. So this is a much different look than the raccoon we just saw. Here is a close-up of a gray squirrel track. You can see all these dots of the metacarpal pad, which we'll talk about in a moment, and see these 3 toes in a row up here in this hind foot. That is a rodent morphology to look for. Then we have animals that have 5 toes on their front feet and 4 on their hind feet. So a lot of people will recognize this track pattern at the bottom as a cottontail rabbit. They have 5 on their front feet, 4 on their hind. And then if this was interactive, I would ask you if anybody wanted to guess what kind of turtle. This is a common snapping turtle. We don't have anything else that grows this large. And you see a tail drag down the middle. You can see this disturbance here where the shell has dragged. And then they always walk in an understep walk because they're trapped by their shell. They can't really do a lot of other gaits. And if you count the toes, this is a close-up of the turtle up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 toes on the front foot. And 1, 2, 3, 4 toes on the hind foot. You can see some of the texture on the bottom of the foot here. And then at the bottom, we have a rabbit track. So this is very unusual to see this much detail in a rabbit track. We'll see in a moment when you look at their feet. They have fur covering the entire bottom of their feet. So if you're looking at a cat or a dog foot, you can see the toe pads, and that is not true of rabbits. They are completely covered by hair. So this is a very fine clay silt, and we're getting all of this definition. So this is a front foot on the left, and we have toe 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They have a J shape to their toes, very asymmetrical on their front feet, more symmetrical on their hind feet. We have toes 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is a front track of a rabbit and a hind track, and then our snapping turtle at the top. So more morphology, we're going to use this track here, and this is my dog's track. Dog tracks don't really follow any of the rules. Dog tracks can measure an inch all the way up to 5 inches. If you think about all the different dog breeds, different shapes of feet, some are very round, some are very elongated, but we're just going to use him for an example here because his track in this substrate with the depth of the snow did some kind of neat things. So I took a photo of that. So we're going to count toes. You always start numbering from the inside of the foot. So the dew claw on a cat or dog is toe 1. So we have toe 1 here. This is the dew claw registering. We have toe 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we have a metacarpal pad. So that's this shape. And dogs can be a lot of different shapes. Typically, canines have triangular metacarpal pads and metatarsal with more of a dot. We'll look at that in a moment. But again, this is more of a feline shape, which domestic dogs can often have, and they are the most misidentified tracks of all. A lot of people will see this type of track and not notice that these are claws, or see the shape of this pad and think that it's a mountain lion in New York State. So we get a lot of people posting dog tracks thinking that they're feline tracks. So just be aware of that dogs don't follow the rules. So we have that metacarpal pad there, and then a carpal pad. So if you have a dog or a cat, look at their front leg and run your hand up the back of their leg, and you'll find a dot, and it's a carpal pad. And that registered here, which it doesn't normally register, but the snow was at such a depth and his movement caused that to register. Okay, next thing you want to look at is compression shape. So different animals have typical compression shapes. So round is more indicative of feline. So this is again our bobcat track. Then we have a coyote track here that's registered very oval. And then we have cottontail tracks that are extremely oval. We have front tracks down here, hind tracks up here. So look for compression shapes. It can help you narrow down who the track might belong to. More field marks. We talked about the palm pad shape, size of toe pads compared to palm pad. You're looking for symmetry. Some animals have good symmetry and some do not. And some have leading toes and some do not. And then we want to look at negative space shape. So what does all of that mean? We're looking at the palm pads. So this is a coyote track again, and see how it's triangular, where the bobcat track is more of a trapezoid. And then for our rodents, we just have dots, lots of dots. So these are the front tracks down here. These two dots back here are carpal pads. Actually, one is a metacarpal pad for a vestigial, which means it's not really used anymore and it's very doesn't register very much, but it causes this little dot back there. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, so we're looking at our coyote track. You've got these big oval toes. If we look at our bobcat track, they're more narrow, sometimes even teardrop shaped. And then again, dots for our rodents. So if you want to take those toes and think how many of those toes will fit inside this metacarpal pad, this is one way to distinguish feline versus canine tracks. So in our canine track, we can fit 2.5, maybe 2 3/4 of those toe pads inside that palm pad. But we easily fit all 4 for the cat. And then the dots are just kind of equal in size. So for canines, we look for, you can fit 2 to 3 toes in that metacarpal pad. Felines, 3 to 4 toes. So if you're not sure if it's a canine or a feline track, that's one trick that you can use to try to distinguish. Some more field marks. We talked about palm pad shape. Now we're going to talk about symmetry. So if you took a line and folded this track in half, it's pretty symmetrical. You know, there's some differences, but it's pretty symmetrical. Where with this track, you can't bisect this pad and have an equal number of toes. Cats have a leading toe that's very prominent. There's also a leading toe on this animal, and it's typically, well, in these cats and dogs, it's always the 3rd toe. So remember, we're counting toe 1 as the dew claw. Then we're going with your index finger. And if you look at your hand, your 3rd finger, which is your middle finger, is typically your longest finger. And that is true of cats and it's true of dogs to a lesser degree. But for cats, they do have a prominent leading toe. So this is a left front track of a bobcat. And I know that because the leading toe is toe 3. So we would have dew claw as toe 1, 2, and 3. And this is a right front track of a coyote. See how this is slightly leading, but not nearly as much as over here. So you can't make this into a neat fold in half track, but you can over here with the rodent track, and you can on the left with the canine track. So that's another thing to look for. If you see a track on the ground, you don't know if it's a canine or feline, see if you can imagine folding it in half and what happens. Does it have a leading toe? Are there claws showing? Cats can show claws, so that's not a diagnostic tool, but they typically do not unless it's really tricky footing or if they're really moving fast, where dogs will very often show claws like these here. All right, negative space. So the negative space on a track is the part of the track that the toes and heel pad are not impressing on. So here you see this mound here on the coyote in the middle. We call it a pyramid, and the substrate will squish up between the toes and cause these raised areas. Where if you look at the cat, that really hasn't happened here. You know, their weight is more evenly placed and their palm pad is much larger. So there's not as much area for that substrate to squish up in. And then as far as rodents, they've got this big, big space here. So we're looking at canines. It is an X-shaped negative space. You can pretty much, unless it's a domestic dog, for all wild canines, you can typically draw a nice X there. For cats, it's more of a C shape. And then there's this just big blocky area for rodents and some other animals. So another trick is to try to draw that X in the cat. You will bisect the pad in a cat. You can't make this neat X and avoid the metacarpal pad like you can on the left with the dog track. Now, on the right is a domestic dog track, and they can have an H-shaped negative space. Remember, I said they don't follow rules. So it's an X, but it's just kind of off kilter a bit. So if you look at all these with the negative space, you have this mound here on the first one, and then you have that rectangular area on the rodent track. This is a squirrel track. You have the C shape on the bobcat track, and then this wacky H shape on the domestic dog track. So these are all points of information that you can gather to make the best identification when you're out in the field. There are some more things to look at. So you want to look for claws. You want to notice if there's fur in the track. Some animals have a lot of fur on their feet, like that cottontail rabbit we talked about. And some don't have any, like skunks have completely naked pads on their feet. There's no fur on them at all. So you want to look for carpal pads and proximal pads. Up here at the top, we have this rodent track, squirrel track, and we talked about these two dots in the back. So these are two proximal pads, which just means in the back of the foot. One is a carpal pad, this one, and then this one is that metacarpal 1 pad. So this pad goes to there. These two toes share a pad, and this pad goes to that toe. So you want to look for proximal pads. If you see these two dots at the back of a track, that's usually indicative of either a rodent or skunk. This is a skunk track here. I'm hoping you can see my cursor. So the track second from the left is a skunk track. And one thing that we look for in identifying skunk tracks is they're very small. This is only about 1 inch long on this section here. These are two proximal pads that are behind the metacarpal pad. And you see these really long claws. So sometimes you won't even notice that they're so long because you won't see them as connected to the track. They're so far ahead. So skunks are diggers, and they have really very long claws on their front feet. Striped skunks, spotted skunks in other areas don't have quite that long of a claw. We have our bobcat track over here, which we talked about. We're not seeing any fur in that track. We're not seeing any claws. I'm not seeing any webbing, which a beaver or an otter would have. And then another thing to look for is if the front and hind are the same or different. And we're going to look at some feet, and we'll go over that in a little bit more depth. So we've got our canine track again here. And then if you look all the way to the right, this is one of my favorite animals to track and trail because they have the greatest tracks. So see all these striations all the way around? This is all fur. So this animal has a very, very furry foot. If you look at it, it's a canine track. You can draw an X in it. If you look at this canine track of the coyote that we've been working with, and this track, do you notice the difference in the fur? And then if you look really close, there's this callus bar that's registering. So that does not have any fur on it. So you typically can see it really well. We can also see it slightly over here. So this is the hind foot here, which is much smaller than the front foot. We've got some claws all the way around, a lot of hair in the foot, but really the diagnostic on this track is this chevron is what it's called. It's a chevron shape. It's a callus pad, and it's on the front and hind, but the rest of the foot is typically very covered with fur. This is a red fox, and their tracks are like art. Beautiful. One note about substrate variability and snowmelt and aging. All of these tracks have one thing in common. They're all made by the same animal. It's my dog. So if you notice this middle track here at the top, it's very clear, crisp edges. You can see where the snow has melted. This track was very new. It had just been made and I snapped a picture. The next track over doesn't look like that track, but it's the same animal. So this track has been snowed in. It's a little bit older. You still have some definition, but it's very different looking than the first track. On the third track, this is in sand. So you almost can't even tell what it is unless you know what you're looking for. But that is made by the same animal. Then we have some front tracks here on the lower left. And this is made in mud. So you can see the squish coming up. You can make that H shape in the negative space. We're seeing some claws up at the top. So this is a front track. So a little bit wider, not quite as narrow. And then the next one over, these claw marks are kind of making it look like these toes are teardropped. And this is why people misidentify domestic dog tracks as cougar tracks quite often. This is an older snow track that has had some snow melt. So this had some sun melt happening. That blurs the edges. It makes things kind of blend together and makes the tracks much larger than they were originally. The next track over is extremely new. That was happened, and then I took the photo. I thought it was super cool. It's a hind track, and you can see the texture of the pads actually, and cats will not have that. Cats, if you have a cat and a dog, touch the pads of their feet. You'll notice your dog has very rough, textured foot pads, and the cats are very soft, usually without much texture. So that's another thing you can look for. So this is a track in silt and has all kinds of detail, but if you notice, the claws are not showing because the dog did not sink into the mud very deeply, where we do have claw marks in the snow, claw marks in the sand, claw marks in this older track, claw marks in the mud, and then all the way on the right is that wet track on plywood. And again, no claw marks, but the dog clearly has them. They just don't register because they're held above the ground, where they come out above the toe pad. So all of these, again, are the same animal, and look how different they look. But if you notice this line right here, and I'm hoping you can see my cursor, the toe on the right, if you look at that angle, you can see that same angle in all of these tracks. So this is the same dog. And you look for things like that. All of these have that hard line, even on the front feet. So this is the foot. He's a couch potato. He doesn't wear the fur down on his foot too much. This is a hind track. And you see this big ball here with wings. That's a typical canine trait. And then the front foot is much wider, much larger palm pad. He's a pretty big dog. So this is the front foot on the left and the hind foot on the right. And dogs are more barrel chested as opposed to a bear that's more back heavy. So dogs, cats, their front feet are larger than their hind feet, and animals like beavers that are very back heavy, bears, they have larger hind feet than front feet. Same thing with raccoons. So that's another thing to look for is the size of the foot different if you can see a whole trail and know that you're looking at front and hind feet. We're not going to get into gaits tonight because it's a huge topic, but I just wanted you to look at these track patterns. And these are all different animals. Actually, there's two of the same animal on here doing two different gaits. All animals walk, trot, they can lope, they can gallop, they can bound, but they have a preferred way of travel. So you'll probably recognize the one on the left as a cottontail rabbit. Here we have a 2x2 bound of a mink. And this is a typical mustelid pattern. Their front feet land, pick up off the ground, and their hind feet land in the exact same spot. So there's actually 4 tracks right here. This is a squirrel bound, and we have 2 front tracks, and then we have 2 hind tracks, and then the squirrel is bounding all the way up here, and that's how squirrels typically move. They can walk though, and will leave a walking pattern, but squirrel bounds are more common. We have our bobcat in this track, and they do an overstep walk. So we have a front track and a hind track, and a front track and a hind track, and a front track and a hind track, and so on and so on. So this is a right front, right hind, left front, left hind, and that is a typical cat pattern. This really cool pattern is my favorite animal to trail, and we have them on the property, and they are very active, very unpredictable. Canines typically will go in a straight line. You know, a fox or a coyote, they're going from point A to point B, but this is a fisher track, and they just wind all over the place. They're so fun. So this is called a 4x4 lope, and it's a slower lope. So we have a front track and a hind track and a front track and a hind track, and then that pattern just repeats. So as the animal's moving, its front right is coming down, its front left is coming down, and then as those fronts pick up to go to the next spot, it's right front, right hind, and left hind is the last one to register. So gaits would be, you know, another hour-long topic. This is also an overstep walk. This is a bear trail. And if you notice the similarity between the cat and the bear, but we're looking at different morphology. A bear foot looks very different than a canine foot. They have a different number of toes, a different shape of a metacarpal pad, a lot of things to look for to distinguish bears from other animals. And then we have another mink trail, and this is a mustelid bound. So we're seeing all 4 feet, but they're not landing on top of each other like they were in the pattern over here on the far left. And then the last one is a unique species that you can always pick this animal out because nobody else walks like it. This is a raccoon trail. And if you're looking at all of these different ways of moving, notice here with our mink trail with the 2x2. So you're only seeing 2 tracks, but there are 4 here. But the diagonal is the same, and you're going to want to look for that if you find a 2x2 trail, because on a raccoon trail, you're going to have alternating angles for the most part, unless the animal is moving, you know, at an extremely steady pace. And then we're looking at more of a rhombus kind of shape for the mink in this one, and the 4x4, of course, they're just diagonals. So just a lot of different track patterns caused by different gaits. So that's a big topic. So now we're going to look at some feet. This is my domestic cat, and he was not roadkill. He was sitting on my bed when I took these. So if you look at a cat track, you can kind of imagine this flipping over and landing here, and this pad would squish into a more trapezoidal shape as the pressure from the weight of the animal pressed it down, and these toes would spread out a little bit. So this is a front foot. You can see the carpal pad here. You can see a dew claw here. So this is a right front of a cat. You can see the leading toe here, which is his 3rd toe if we count dew claw 1, and then toe 2, toe 3. This one is leading, and this is a front track right here. And this is the front track here. So a way to tell if it's a hind or a front on a cat, if you draw a line across the top of this metacarpal pad, you're going to usually touch one of these toes, where on the hind track, you can usually draw a line and not touch the toes. So if we draw a line down here, there's your hind track, and here we're touching those toes when we go across the metacarpal. So domestic cat tracks are really fun to find. They've got these little toe beans, just really perfect and pretty. Now this is a bobcat foot. So we have a carpal pad down here. We have a dew claw here. So that makes this a left front foot. And then if you imagine flipping this over and having it land in the track, this is a left front track. So we have a leading toe. We have this M shape or trapezoidal shaped palm pad, very asymmetrical. And you don't really notice the asymmetry quite as much when you're looking at the foot, but see how the difference between the hind track and the front track. So a bobcat's hind foot can often look very canine. See how this metatarsal pad, which is the palm pad of the hind foot, is very triangular, and these toes are tighter in together. So if you look at the front track versus the hind track, you may notice that one is round, the other is more oval. The toes, this is the same animal, the feet are from the same animal. It was a roadkill bobcat, unfortunately, from my friend Kim Cabrera. And then just notice the differences, because if you're looking at a trail, you want to know how to tell the difference between front and hind. So that's a bobcat. And then this is a gray fox, which we do have in this area. And we have a hind track. So see this ball here, like you saw on my dog's foot. And then the front foot is a little bit of a different shape. So if you imagine flipping these upside down, we have this hind track up here with the dot, and then we have the front foot here. And this is that pyramid that we talked about. You can make an X in this. And these are very small. Look at your scale over here. So gray fox is typically around 1.5 inches, 1 3/4, much smaller than other animals at same size. Okay, so we looked at that gray fox foot where we can see the pads, but look at this red fox foot. The pads are so tiny. They're actually all of this, but they're just covered in fur. This is that chevron callus bar, which is showing up here and then also up here. See how furry they are? This is a different fox than the other ones. You're seeing some claws up above. Yeah, there's some other stuff going on here, but they're some of my favorite tracks. So that is red fox. This is red fox on the left, gray fox on the right, just to show you the differences. They're pretty similar in size, but the tracks are much different. Then we have our coyotes, which are very plentiful here in New York State. And if you would flip these over, you see this little dot here. This is more of a dot, as opposed to this is more of a fuller pad. This is the front foot and the hind foot is on the left. So we have more of a triangular pad for the front foot, which is the right sided track. See these claws coming in, and then we have this hind foot, which is smaller and has this smaller metatarsal pad. Long-tailed weasel. So this is our largest weasel. We have least weasels and short-tailed weasels in my area as well. But mustelid feet, which is the weasel family, are really strange. They have all of these little pads. So we have toe 1 with its pad. We have toe 2 with its pad. Toe 3 and 4, like the squirrel did, share a pad. And then toe 5 has its own pad. And then the front foot also has 5 toes and individual pads and a carpal pad. So these are long-tailed weasel tracks. They can look very similar to squirrel tracks, but if you notice, they don't have those 2 proximal pad dots in the back. And they are just a little bit of a different shape, more oval as opposed to round. And they're very hard to find outside of snow. I was really happy to find these in the mud. This is a typical pattern that you see in the snow. We call it a dumbbell pattern. So the animal is leaping and then jumping all the way up here. And you'll see this in fields and in the woods. Then we have our mink. Mink are also some of my favorite tracks. They're just so pointy and look like little stars. So this is, there's a little chipmunk track down there too. This is typical mink bound, where you're going to see all 4 feet, but the front feet, which is here, nope, right here. Now I'm getting confused of which is which. This is a hind track. So this is a front, this is a front, this is a hind. Okay, so here, this is a better example. We have the front tracks are more round. And then if you look at the hind tracks, these 2 toes here, toes 3 and 4, are typically really close together on a hind track on a mink. So if you look at the feet, you can see that echoed over here too. So our hind foot is on the left, and see how these toes 3 and 4 are closer together, and this thumb is dropped way down. This is a front track. We have a proximal pad here, carpal pad, and just a little bit more symmetry there than the hind foot. And that's a typical bound at the top of a mink. Then we have fishers, which we've already talked about, but this you can see all of the different metacarpal pads, which are also registering here. So they share that pad on 3 and 4. We have toe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And these are the pads that go with these toes up here. And then we also have a front track, also has 5 toes. They have claws, carpal pad here. And if you are in New York State, fishers have really done very well with their expansion. So you can find these tracks in the snow pretty easily. in a lot of wooded areas. Then we have river otters, and they have really strange feet. So we have our front foot on the left here, and then our hind tracks. See this dropped thumb? That is one thing to look for in otter tracks, and you can see that right up here in the track at the top. This is a left hind track. So you have your 4 toes, which that can look very much like a canine track, but then you look for this dropped toe and the webbing. See these lines in between the toes? That is the webbing that you're seeing here. It doesn't always register, but if you see it, it is diagnostic. And this is an otter trail. And I find these quite often. They're really fun. They're very active, and especially if it's a family group. Striped skunk. So skunk feet are really very different. Their toes are semi-fused together, so they're not going to have splay as much as other animals. You can see how this fusing is happening here. And their front tracks have really long claws. So this is in mud and snow. You can see the morphology though. See these long claws up here. We're seeing the hind pad here, the heel pad. And this is a typical skunk way of moving. So they're overstep walking. So it's a front track and a hind track, and a front track and a hind track. Whoops, I went too far. So those are skunk tracks. And again, these are much smaller than you would think. Skunks have very tiny feet for the size of animal they are. Then we have our raccoons, and we have a front track of a raccoon on the left and hind foot, front foot, hind foot here, which is much longer. And they don't typically register this heel area. You'll typically see it like this here in the mud, where we have a front left track, and this is a right hind track. Where over here, this is registering the whole heel, which makes it really easy to tell front from hind. Sometimes it is very difficult. I've purposely chosen ones that are easy to tell. So we have a right front track here, and a left hind, and a left front, and a right hind. Cottontail, we talked about how fur covered their feet are, and there really are no pads that you can see. And these are the front tracks, which we went over before. This was kind of a neat trail. I was trailing a fox actually, and came across this rabbit trail that was hopping along. I came in from the bottom of the screen, and when the rabbit saw the fox, it took off running. So this is the same animal, but look how splayed its toes are. And look how tight this is over on the left when it was just kind of hopping along, not worrying about anything. There's also a huge distance difference between front, big space, hind, and then here they're all kind of close together. So this is a slower moving animal on the left and a much faster moving animal on the right. And that was kind of a neat story to be able to decipher. When the animals were gone, they weren't there any longer, of course, but I could tell what had happened overnight. So that was fun. Gray squirrel, we've talked about squirrel tracks quite a bit. So we're gonna mosey on past this one because it looks like we're getting close to time. But their feet are really neat and their tracks are really cool. Woodchuck is just a big squirrel. It's a big ground squirrel. And if you see on this front track, we have a hind track here and then a front track. These big pads really register nicely. So if you look at this front track, they're usually angled. Their claws are angled in. They're pigeon-toed. And then they have these giant carpal pads back here, or proximal pads. One is a carpal pad, and again, one is metacarpal one. And then we have a bound. Sometimes they will bound, but they usually walk and trot. This is a walking overstep walk here. We have a front track at the bottom and a hind track. You can see those 3 toes, even though it's a little messy, which tells you that it's from the rodent family. And the same with this bound. If you saw this, you don't have a lot of detail, but you see those 3 toes in a row to tell you that it is a rodent. And because of the size, it can only be a woodchuck in this area. These were really big. Beavers, biggest rodent that we have in New York State. And sometimes you'll find a tail impression, which is really cool. You typically will just see their hind tracks, even though their front feet do register. Their hind foot is so much larger and it usually lands right on top. But if you're lucky enough to find a front track, this is what it looks like down here in the lower right. And they are pigeon-toed also. Everything kind of points inward. And then you'll usually only see 2 or 3 toes on the outside. These toes that should be here just don't register very much. So if you look at the very top of the screen, we have 5 toes registering, which is pretty cool. Doesn't happen a lot. And then you're seeing the 3 toes, 3 toes, 3 toes. Black bears. I got to trail one of these just this weekend. And we have front feet on the left. See that carpal pad? And then we have hind feet, which look very different. Now, bear feet are very different from our feet in that their little toe is on the inside, where our big toe is on the inside. So this here is, if I'm flipping it over, get confused when I'm looking at it upside down. This is a left front of a bear, and this is a left hind of a bear. No, that's a right hind. Getting confused. We're going to look at the track. So this is a right front of a bear, and that is a left front of a bear on the actual foot. So see this big carpal dot back here? We have a big metacarpal pad. We have toe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then on this hind track, this is also a right hind. We have a toe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So bear tracks are pretty hard to mistake for anything else. And then these, of course, are white-tailed deer tracks. And we have a front track or a front foot on the left and a hind foot on the right. Look at these dew claws here. This is one way that you can tell which foot it is. If they do register, the front foot dew claws angle outward and the hind foot dew claws angle forward. And you can see this in this galloping deer that we have a front, a hind, a hind. So deer tracks are pretty easy to find. You can learn a lot from deer. So if you want more, I'm happy to go into better detail about any of those signs. If you would like to get certified, there is an organization called Tracker Certification North America. It is a division of Cyber Tracker Conservation, which is based in South Africa. And they offer evaluations in track and sign all over the country and in trailing. So it's a great group. We have, I think, 14 professional in the country right now. And then additionally, there's another level called specialist that you can get to. But it's just a great 2-day in the field activity. Then there's a lot of books. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but you can rewatch this and pause it. There's also websites listed there that are very high quality websites with great information. More books, Facebook groups. If you're on Facebook, there is one called Original Wisdom's Tracking Community that is all about morphology. And then Animals Don't Cover Their Tracks, which is all about track identification. So people will post tracks and then we'll try to identify them for them. There is an app called iTrack Wildlife, and it's excellent, run by Jonah Evans, who is one of the evaluators for tracker certification. More books there on the left. And so just get outside. That is the best thing that you can do. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Shane. That was very detailed information. Excellent. Let's see, there's a question from Steve Kinney. Can you share some tips on photographing tracks? Also, any good track apps you can recommend, which you did just.
That's the best track app. iTrack, definitely. It's just excellent in every way. It has all kinds of information, not just tracks. For photographing tracks, that's a great question. Having scale, if you don't have a ruler, I carry a ruler everywhere I go when I'm outside. So, but a lot of people don't. But if you have a coin in your pocket or something that is just a standard size, put that down next to the track without covering the track, and then photograph straight down on top of the track. So you're looking straight down, and that will cause the least amount of distortion. If you don't have anything in your pocket, you can use your hand, put your hand next to it. But then if you're going to post it on a website for identification, also take a photo of your hand when you get home with a ruler. And then that will help people really understand the size. But yeah, photographing tracks accurately is very helpful.
Okay, let's see.
Can I just jump in real quickly?
Sure, yeah, go ahead, Steve.
As far as the lighting, a lot of times, especially in snow, it's really difficult to get the shadowing and stuff right so they can really make out the track very well. So any thoughts as far as the lighting to get a better one?
Yeah, I shade my tracks. So I'll use my body to shade the tracks. Bright sunlight, especially I go to a place called the Mud Flats that if it's a sunny day, the mud acts like a mirror, actually. So you can bring an umbrella, which a lot of my tracker friends do, or you can use your body or your friend, say, hey, stand there, give me some shade. And taking photos in the shade is much easier to see. Now, if it's really dark and you're looking at snow, sometimes the sun can help you, but I find shading the tracks usually will make them clearer in a photo.
Do you ever use any artificial light, like a flashlight, or does somebody get a different shadowing?
I do carry a flashlight if I'm going to be under a bridge. And then, yes, you do have to use a flashlight, but that sometimes can cause some weird shadows and things. So yeah, it just depends on the track and where you are of what you need to do to get that photo.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay. Let's see. Connie said the resources went by too fast. Could they go to everyone from me? Connie, this will be recorded and put on the Naturalist Exchange YouTube channel. And so, Peter, that's an answer to your question too. So yes, once it's up there, you can share it with anybody. But Shane, would you have the list of resources handy that you could just email to me, and then I could email them out to the group?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll do that.
I have a document. We do a lot of classes, so I can share that with you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, any other questions? Right, thanks so much, Shane. Thank you for being the first of the new group to go. We have more coming up in future months, and thanks to everybody who participated tonight, and I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving.
Wonderful. Thank you.